Thank you so much, Nicole. That was a great introduction. Does anyone have any questions for Nicole at this time? I'll just take a moment to pause. We're actually a minute ahead of schedule here. And if not, I'll keep an eye on the chat, but I don't see anything coming up right now. Okay, so I will go ahead and share my screen again. Okay. So next, I'm going to turn it over to Melanie, who is going to introduce our plenary speaker for this morning.
Good morning, everyone. Next up, we have Bethany Bradley from the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Bethany is a professor of biogeography and spatial ecology, one of the founders of Northeast RISCC, and the university director of the Northeast CASC. Today, she's going to talk about implications of climate change for invasive species. Bethany?
Thanks, Melanie. Thanks, Chelsea. I will see if I can remember how to use Zoom. It's been such a long time since I last used it yesterday, I think. All right, awesome. Yeah, so really nice to be here. I am tasked with giving kind of a primer on the science behind how invasive species and climate change are interacting. So we can, and I am a professor, as Melanie said, at UMass Amherst, which is the host for the Northeast Climate Adaptation Science Center. So as Nicole mentioned before, the CASCs and the RISC networks are closely aligned. So before I get started, the stuff that I'm going to talk about today is also in a synthesis document. In the Northeast, we call these management challenges. And the North Central is working on this same synthesis document. So you guys should see this in your emails within the next couple of weeks, one that's sort of tuned for the North Central. But a lot of the stuff that we talk about in the Northeast is relevant, very, highly relevant for what's going on in the North Central region as well. So if you want a refresher on kind of the main ways that invasive species and climate change interact, I would invite you to look at our management challenge called Double Trouble. So I think everybody in the audience who has interacted with invasive species knows that we've got plenty of stuff on our hands to deal with, that invasive species cause a lot of dramatic impacts on ecosystems and our natural resources. In fact, they're one of 5 major forms of anthropogenic global change, including climate change. So we've got plenty of things that we're already dealing with. And now we're here at this workshop saying, in addition to thinking about invasive species, we also want you to think about climate change. And so I would argue before we even get started that that's a lot of things to think about, but what invasive species management is already doing is thinking ahead, that invasive species management at its core is proactive. So we're thinking ahead towards the next wave or generation of invasive species that are coming on the horizon. We're constantly thinking about new and better ways to manage and control those species. We're thinking about what are the areas that we want to prioritize for that management, what's most vulnerable in terms of our ecosystems, in terms of our economies. And so adding a climate change framing to this is just another opportunity to be proactive. So the more we know, the bigger that opportunity is, because we can think further ahead and identify, what's coming, understand ways to control invasive species, and identify better those highly vulnerable ecosystems. So what I want to talk about today are kind of 4 main things of the way that invasive species and climate change interact. And I'll caveat this with, I'm a terrestrial plant person, so there's going to be a little bit more planty focus to this, but certainly a lot more on the insects and diseases side as well. So what we'll talk about is interactions between rising temperatures and invasives, range shifting invasive species. We'll talk about climate change as a novel disturbance favoring invasive species, and then we'll close out with plant response directly to rising CO2. So starting with that first one, rising temperatures and invasive species. This is now almost 10 years old. I should update this to the more recent IPCC report. But as of the 2013 IPCC report, warming temperatures and longer growing seasons are virtually certain. If we can come up with an adjective that's even more than virtually, we're definitely there now in terms of our certainty of climate warming and longer growing seasons. And so what does that do in terms of interacting with invasive species? Well, one piece is that as you look into warmer climates, you see a greater variety and abundance of insect pests. The vast majority of insect pests are ectotherms, so they need heat from the environment. And as temperatures warm, you end up with higher populations of defoliating insects and bark beetles. This picture is a species of winter moth, which is problematic in the Northeast and temperate forests especially. And that's not only true for non-native invasive species, but also true for some of our native forest pests. So this is just an example that I'm sure you are all familiar with, that there are increasing numbers of outbreaks of mountain pine beetle. And a lot of that is due to higher success in individual beetles overwintering and multiple life cycles because of a longer growing season. If we turn over to look at plants, there is consistent evidence that rising temperatures favor invasive plants. And this graph is from a meta-analysis. So essentially what a meta-analysis is in this case in ecology is where you go back to the literature and you find all of the studies that have, so in this case, compared elevated temperature for native plant species and for invasive plant species. And then a meta-analysis essentially reanalyzes all of those data, which gives us more statistical power to say that there is or isn't an effect. And so an effect size of 0 right here, if we're crossing the hash line at 0, that means that there was no significant difference in this case between a native plant response under ambient versus elevated temperature. However, there was, little star, a significant increase in performance of invasive plants associated with elevated temperature. No significant difference associated with changes in increases in precipitation, some actually decline associated with drought. But focusing on this elevated temperature, why would we expect that invasive plants would do better under elevated temperature, whereas many of our native plants do not? So one hypothesis for that is the idea of priority effects for invasive species. If plants were birds, whatever that analogy is, the early bird catching the worm is sort of the equivalent of this. That we see many invasive plants, and this is especially true in temperate forest ecosystems. We see many invasive plants that are actually able to green up very early in the growing season. So if I go out into my backyard, I live in Massachusetts, I can wander around the forest actually right about now and see species like Japanese barberry, multiflora rose, and buckthorn starting to green up early, while the native shrubs, native herbaceous species, and certainly the canopy trees are still dormant. So if you're early, that means that you are first out of the gate, have advantage of all of those resources while other plants are dormant. And because we observe this consistently with invasive species, as temperature is warming, that means that you have even more available resources for those invasive species early in the season. And indeed, if we look at some other analyses of whether how invasive species are responding to warming temperature relative to natives, one thing that we see is that invasive species tend to be strongly temperature responsive. That is, they are able to shift their growing season earlier and earlier in response to warmer climate and longer growing seasons, whereas our native species And even our non-native but not invasive species, those guys are not doing much at all. They are more attuned to daylight cues, presumably, or they are just not very responsive to temperature. And so their flowering time is not shifting. So this is from a study that was actually in Massachusetts. It was looking at historical records of plant collections in herbarium records, and they were able to document flowering time back to the early 1900s for native, non-native, and invasive species. And they found that the invasive species relative to the natives had shifted their flowering time nearly 2 weeks earlier during that 100-year time period. So take-home point on this is that invasive species are taking advantage of longer growing seasons. They're doing that by emerging earlier, which is increasing their impacts on native ecosystems. Second main point that we want to talk about is climate change and range shifts. And I want to start actually talking about native species and what we know about the movement of native species. So I'm from Massachusetts, so I'm using this Massachusetts scale, but a really important piece of this is that climate change is happening fast, super fast, way faster than any climate change in any paleoclimate record. So if this is sort of temperature-wise versus temperature geography lining up for the late 1900s of where Massachusetts was, we are moving into the tri-state area currently, and depending on our different emission scenarios, Massachusetts may well by the end of the century end up with climate much more similar to the Southeast. So in that 100-year period, that means that our climate is changing kind of the equivalent of about 800 miles of distance. And that's going to be true of any of the north central states as well. So temperature is changing the equivalent of 800 miles over the course of 100 years. How fast are native species moving? Well, this is one good example. This is also a northeasty example, but comparable, I would imagine, to much of what's going on in forested systems in the West, which is that in this study, there was a repeat study of forest edge. So basically the edge between northern hardwoods and high elevation boreal forest, where they measured this in 1964 and then repeated those same measurements along the similar transects in 2004. And they found, as we're seeing consistently in response to climate change, that this northern hardwood edge had shifted up while the high elevation boreal forest lower edge had contracted upwards. But the estimate of how far those trees had moved, and of course, you know, I mean, got to give trees a break. They probably don't move super fast, or shouldn't be expected to move super fast. But they moved about 600 feet over the course of 40 years. Okay, comparing that to 800 miles that they would need to move over the course of 100 years. The answer is, to how fast native species are moving, is not fast. Definitely not fast enough to be even close or in the ballpark to keeping up with climate change. In contrast, we are doing an awesome job of helping distribute and move non-native and invasive species. You know, we think of native species as being distributed by birds, being distributed by wind, you know, flowing along waterways. That is not sufficient to help native species keep up. So instead, we are planting invasive species in our gardens. We are hauling whatever the heck this stuff is all over to different lake systems. We are doing a great job of moving those invasive species, non-native and invasive species, those hundreds of miles that they would need to be essentially pre-adapted to climate change. So on top of that, we are seeing a change in the geography of risk from invasive species. So this is plant-focused models from about 900 invasive plants across the US. And the areas in red, so you can see a whole bunch of these higher elevation areas across the West, some areas in the North Central and the upper Midwest that are expected to see a lot more invasive plant species in coming years because the climate is becoming more suitable for those species. So one thing that in the Northeast that we've put together, and this was supported by the Northeast IPM Center, is a tool. So this works for any state. This is just an example for the state of Montana. You can search for your state, and this references back to the data that underlie this map. You can search by state or by county and come up with a list of all of the species that, at least based on our knowledge in 2016, were not present in that county or state, but are projected to expand into that county or state by mid-century, so by 2050. And on the Risk Network website, we have some tutorials for using this tool as well. But one challenge that we ran into in the Northeast, though, because we've been presenting this listing tool to Northeast states, was that this list gets pretty long. So 42 new species just moving into the state of Montana by mid-century. And if you look at it at a county by county basis, this list becomes really, really long. And so what a lot of folks said to us was, 42 species in the Northeast, we're dealing with a couple hundred species. Can you narrow that list down a little bit and really prioritize which species we should be looking out for? And so one ongoing project that we're doing in the Northeast, this is an option or a possibility for future work in the North Central, is to then hone in on those species that have the highest ecological and or socioeconomic impacts, and that with those impacts are known to affect ecosystems, for example, in the North Central region. So we've narrowed down 188 species range shifting into the Northeast to a priority list of more like 25 species that we know are likely to have high impacts. So take-home point on this is that invasive species ranges are shifting and are responding to temperature, but with these types of tools, with this type of forecasting, we actually have a chance to get ahead of some of them, identify the ones that are likely to come into our counties or states, and potentially either regulate them, potentially monitor for them, but get ahead of the management of those species. Third thing that I want to talk about is climate variability creating disturbance. This was a review of forest responses to climate change across the world. And so this is just some examples from North America. And what this review found was that extreme heat and drought causes high levels of disturbance to native forest ecosystems. So in the Western US, and that you can see all these numbers on here, those are all individual studies. So lots of different studies supporting a link between forest die-off and drought in the West, and some other climate drivers affecting tree mortality in the East. In addition to the link to drought, you all know in the West that there are increasing numbers of fires happening, which are also creating large-scale disturbances. So this is just in terms of the graph, is showing all these red dots are from the 2000s, the blue dots are from the 80s and 90s, showing that area burned is increasing considerably, and that is largely driven by these drier conditions across the West. So disturbance reduces the resilience of native ecosystems. We also know that many, if not most, invasive species thrive under disturbed conditions. So this is a graph for a forest understory invasive plant, garlic mustard. As you increase seeds and increase disturbance, you end up with these big populations of invasive species. I'm sure many of you have seen something like this in the West of these large flushes of invasive species following fire, because lots of resources now available. Since many of our native species are long-lived and slow to grow, you end up with this grass fire cycle essentially perpetuating itself in the West. So a take-home point on that is that climate extremes are creating novel disturbance. And what that ends up doing is reducing the resilience of native ecosystems, harming native species, and providing this big opening for invasive species. And as I'm sure you all know, once invasive species are established, have established populations, it is really, really hard to reduce or control those populations. And then the last piece that I want to talk about is specifically related to plants and invasive plants and rising CO2. So I'm sure that you've seen something similar to this graph. So this is a graph of atmospheric CO2. This is actually measured at the top of the Mauna Loa Observatory on the Big Island of Hawaii. So very far away from kind of direct human activity. That makes it a pretty good approximation of just generally what's going on in the atmosphere. And you can see this increase over time. In fact, a more rapid increase over recent years and decades. And this weird little sawtooth thing, that's essentially caused by the fact that the Northern Hemisphere happens to have a lot more terrestrial land and therefore a lot more plants than the Southern Hemisphere does. So you end up with this sort of, right about now as everything in the Northern Hemisphere is greening up with the spring, essentially a big inhalation of plants in the Northern Hemisphere, which brings down atmospheric CO2, but then in the northern winters, that rises back up again. You guys probably remember this type of figure from high school biology or more recently, where CO2 is a fertilizer for plants, right? Plants need CO2 and sunlight and water for photosynthesis. And so as we add more CO2, that essentially acts as a fertilizer for for all plants, not just invasive plants. So yes, on the whole, plants do better with higher CO2. We see increased growth rates of trees, shrubs, herbs, crops. We see more flowers, more fruits, larger seed mass. In fact, this was from a website that ExxonMobil had sponsored, saying that more CO2 is actually great for everything because look at how big this tree grows as you increase CO2 in the atmosphere. But what these averages don't show you is that there is a huge variation in the types of species and the way that species are responding to this increase in CO2. And that most of our data really come from, the trees that we're using for timber and a few crops like corn, wheat, and soy that we're growing a lot. We don't know all that much about what's going on with our native species that we are trying to conserve. But there have been quite a few, at least, studies to give us a pretty good hint at what's going on. So we saw this meta-analysis before. I just hadn't shown you this top part. So there have been 45 studies of the effect of elevated CO2 on native plants. And you can see that native plants are, in fact, doing better under have higher performance under elevated CO2. But if you look at the red one, invasive plants are doing even better, and that there is a significant difference between those two types of plants, native and invasive. And why is that? Well, a main hypothesis for this is that invasive plants tend to be weedier, right? They tend to be faster growing, and that those weedier, faster growing species use a lot of resources. So if we give them even more resources through elevated CO2, they perform even better. Another problem with this is not only linked to sort of increased production biomass of invasive species, but the fact that when you relate that to management, and specifically to management with herbicides, we see that as CO2 in the atmosphere increases, invasive species are a lot harder to kill. So this is a essentially side-by-side field experiment for Canada thistle. I'm sure you've all heard of Canada thistle. and basically what happened in this experiment is that under ambient CO2, so this was done in the early 2000s, so we were at wherever we were in the 300s parts per million of CO2 at that point. All of the bunch of Canada thistle plants were planted, as I'm sure everyone would love to plant some Canada thistle. And then all of them were treated with recommended amounts of glyphosate to kill them. So in this case, under ambient CO2, for the most part, it worked, right? You don't see a whole bunch of plants over here, except for that guy that we missed, but we could probably handle him. Can you compare that to future CO2? So this is under elevated CO2 of what conditions are likely to look like in the next, now to the next 20 or 30 years. Same number of plants planted, same recommended amount of glyphosate, lots more invasives coming back. And the reason that they found for this is because what this particular species was doing, and this is true of several other invasive species that they've looked into, is that they're using that increased CO2 to put more biomass below ground. So they have a lot larger root biomass. That means that topical herbicides like glyphosate are not as effective because those species are able to come back from their roots below ground. So that last piece in terms of a take-home point is that all plants are likely to do better, so be bigger, faster, stronger under higher CO2 conditions, but the relative improvements really matter. And so we need to be expecting and be on the lookout for hardier and harder to kill invasive plants. So what do we do about all of these things? This is another what we call management challenge that we've put together with Northeast RISCC. And so we have a set of ideas in this management challenge called Taking Action. And these were all synthesized from a workshop very similar to this one. So I'm really excited for the workshop over the next 2 days to hear what ideas you all have and experience that you can share. Because essentially by sharing information with each other, by coming to workshops like this one, by engaging in broader networks like the North Central RISCC network, we learn from each other and we can try to avoid making the same mistakes in lots of different areas and increase the efficacy of not only thinking ahead, but also the invasive species management actions that we're taking. So you're most welcome to check out Taking Action on the Northeast RISCC website, and also just be thinking about how do all of these components of invasive species and climate change affect your management and your thinking about invasive species. So I'm going to conclude there so that we have a little bit of time for questions and just run through those kind of key points. So one thing that we're seeing is that invasive species are emerging earlier, that they have longer or increasing number of life cycles for pests especially, and that they're becoming more competitive with warming temperatures. Second piece we're seeing is that invasive species ranges are shifting, but by identifying what's coming, I mean, one plus of climate change is we know the species that are to the south of us are in slightly warmer areas. So it's not a total mystery as to what's headed our way. We have a chance to get ahead of them. Third, that climate extremes are creating novel disturbance, and that favors invasive species. And finally, that invasive plants have this strong growth advantage relative to native species under higher atmospheric CO2. So I'll stop there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and welcome any questions that anyone has. And maybe I'll let Melanie or Elizabeth proctor questions. That might be easiest.
Thank you so much. We did have a couple comments in the chat. They're not quite questions, but Dennis Longknife wanted to say that This past summer, we observed our native grasses were maturing 5 to 6 weeks early, with most going dormant by June here in the northern plains of Montana. And we are in our second year of severe to extreme drought.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually, in terms of the not only the shifting earlier of the season, but the earlier ending of the season, and just that kind of thinking about which invasive species that potentially advantages, right? So some of the later growing, we talked about early growing invasive species, but there are plenty of perennial invasives that could be advantaged by that as well.
Adam has a question. I might have missed this, but how does the potential benefit conferred by CO2 increase in interaction with the effect of drought?
Drought actually negates a lot of those benefits. So the, I would say most of what we see, and this is true of both invasive and native species, that under drought conditions, everybody does poorly. So even if you have extreme drought, then everything is going to do poorly. If you have a little bit of drought and increased CO2, then one of the pluses for all plants is that they don't need to have their stomata don't need to be open for as long, and so that actually buffers a little bit against the effects of drought. But certainly, the extreme drought, like this example from Montana, it would counteract any benefit from CO2.
Just a reminder for our audience in general, you can either put questions in the chat or raise your hand and then unmute yourself. Yeah, we can take questions either way. From Wynn, we have, are there any range-shifting natives that are now becoming thought of as invasive?
That's a really good question. I think it's more actually the counterpoint, which is that there have been a decent number of expanding range shifting natives that historically have been thought of as weedy or worth managing, that we should probably be reconsidering, because if they're doing well under future climate conditions, then maybe we should be encouraging. So what Nicole had said previously about the resist, adapt, direct, that directing towards those successfully range shifting natives might actually be the way to adapt in the future. There are certainly weedy native species. Pests also, there are plenty of native pests that are problematic. On the plant side, if you compare the sort of numbers of native plants that are considered weedy versus the number of non-native plants that are considered weedy, the number of non-native plants essentially blows the number of natives out of the water in terms of proportions. So I have not spent too much time worrying about native range shifting species, although we do have a really nice paper from last year, 2 years ago, that kind of goes through a point-by-point risk assessment of what you might consider in terms of thinking about weediness of native range shifting species. That's a paper led by Piper Wallingford and Tony Lynn Morelli, and I can find it as soon as we have a break.
Awesome. Nathan, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, thanks. Great presentation, tons of alarm bells going off. I'm kind of blown away, this is a really concise presentation, and I'm looking at the regional invasive species PDF that was posted from the Northeast chapter. And I'm looking at the policy section, and I'm curious if the organization has been able to kind of find policy wins, because a lot of these seem like they're not necessarily just management or research-based solutions. They need kind of the policy buy-in. I'm wondering if you could talk about some of the successes you've had and potentially some of the barriers. The recent IPCC report is going in my head, where politics is the biggest barrier to movement in that front. So I'm wondering, in terms of the policy, what has the Northeast chapter seen?
No, that's a great question. Thanks, Nate. I would say all politics are local. I would start there. So a lot of what we have been working on in the Northeast is trying to help states to inform and adjust their regulatory processes. So one important piece of information for invasive plants is that the majority of invasive plants are deliberately introduced as ornamental plants, and that states have the power, most states have regulations in their legislature that can prevent the sale and propagation of species that we would consider invasive. But some work led by Eve Beery and Emily Fusco found that across the US, our regulations are reactive. That is, we are not prepared for those range shifting species at all. So part of what we've been doing in the Northeast is we have a working group of Invasive Plant Council representatives, and we have been providing all of those data, the species that we're seeing coming down the line and the species that we would rate as high priority and high impact. And at least for a couple of states, so for Maine, New York, and Massachusetts, we're starting to see pretty good success of the states, including those high impact range shifting species in their risk assessment process, and hopefully eventually getting them into the regulatory process. It's not a fast thing, it's definitely a long term. Yeah, I try to stay out of thinking about global or national politics because it feels less tractable to me than the state.
Quick follow-up: has there been any conversations with industry themselves about that? Because that seems like the other part of the equation, other than the regulatory side.
Preliminary. We've been putting in the Northeast, we've been putting a lot of document synthesis information together for industry. So we have like a management challenge that's called, why we should support native species. We have a, list of native species that are great, climate smart, and great for planting. And we're working on a list of species that we're recommending that we don't sell because they're already invasive in the mid-Atlantic and we don't want to introduce them in the Northeast. That also, though, is a process and one that I personally don't know well because I've mostly worked on the invasive plant side, not too much on the nursery side, but definitely a good point, a direction that we may be headed in the Northeast.
Thank you.
All right, we have just a few more minutes for questions. We're going to take Ty's question and then Dennis.
Let me turn off all the blocks. Great, thank you. Really great talk. It's really wonderful to have you here. So I'm trying to think, how far out in the future can we or do we need to plan? And the context for that is now I'm thinking about all these range shifting species and sort of just this like global reorganization of where things used to be. So if I think the next 10 years, I'm thinking about a bunch of legacy species and a bunch of new species moving in and defining which one's invasive and which one isn't. If I think a couple decades beyond that, sort of everything has rescattered and I'm looking at newly formed like novel ecosystems. And it's sort of just like, for when I'm trying to make a plan right now for how to manage land or how to make recommendations or what we should be doing now, how far out we think seems to change what the goals are. So it seems like a moving target. So where along that trajectory should we be aiming, I guess?
I think that's a brilliant question. And I hope that you have a chance to discuss it more with everyone else through this workshop, because I don't know the answer at all. I will just give a couple of thoughts on it. So the first is sort of time horizon, right? So if we're thinking about like the regulatory process and getting things into state regulation in terms of prohibiting that next wave of species from actually being introduced, in the Northeast, some of those reviews happen every 5 years or every 10 years. So getting stuff in now means that we might have it regulated in 10 years. And so thinking about like how long those processes take is important in terms of what we start working on now versus what we think we can wait a little bit of time for. And I would say the exact same point is relevant for thinking about native ecosystems and, whether we're thinking about climate smart restoration or supporting the movement of native species to resist invasives. thinking about how long those native species live and how long it takes to effectively establish them, you know, that becomes part of the thinking too, right? Even if a species is sort of marginal, a native species is marginal in terms of habitat now, if it's the type of thing that's going to take, you know, us 5 years to actually effectively establish populations, then we can't wait, you know, 10 years to do it with an expectation that we need them in 10 years. But yeah, I would really look forward to everyone's thoughts on that question.
All right, Dennis.
Hello. We too are seeing an increase in cheatgrass here on our prairies, and with the drought we're in, our second year drought, we also have a grasshopper epidemic that started last year, and APHIS came and helped us, but because of COVID and supply chain stuff and planning, they did not get to hit the target at the precise time when they needed to get the grasshoppers at the right stage of development. But anyway, we're planning to have them come again this year because we're planning the grasshopper epidemic usually starts in May. So along the roadways, we see sweet clover totally stripped of foliage. So.
Yeah, that point actually is a really good one, that the timing of management also needs to be shifting with climate change, that, you know, that May 15th or whatever the date has been historically may be changing. And I think this is a really good case example. One thing that we've done in the Northeast is to try to bring people together across, you know, just like here, across state borders, but to talk about a specific invasive species, because we may find that, you know, that there are folks in the room from Wyoming or, you know, further south who are dealing with exactly that problem and could give some insight into it. So I hope that happens.